massive number of challenges facing HR. This section really has a shopping list of a whole series of them. We're going to cover a lot of them in depth later on, but I want to make certain I'm priming the pump, so to speak, in your head that some of the HR really has a huge amount of work we get to address. It could be a fun area to work in because it has so many different things. Sometimes it's hectic because just about every crisis deals with humans. And oh, by the way, when it deals with humans, a lot of times ends up in human resources as you go through. Some of the skills needed to manage a diverse workforce: communicate effectively. I mean, forget all the rest of it, communicate effectively. And that means you got to pay attention to every single word that you say on a formal basis. Sometimes you got to write a policy. Sometimes you got to write a procedure, sometimes a practice, the 3 Ps. At the lowest level, let's see, somebody wants to come in as you go through. Well, our hiring committees have to consist of the following components and everything else. That's more of a policy as you go through. How you go about doing that is a procedure, but something as simple of make certain that if you're going to allow the person being interviewed to look at the questions, by the way, it's recommended practice, take them to the table and provide a bottle of water with each new candidate that comes in. Now, by the way, that's not going to be in a policy. That's not going to be in a procedure. That's going to be in the practice as you go through. That takes effective communication, what you're expecting your HR specialist to do with every single interview in the process. Pay attention to that, because that detail, sometimes you need to go through and pay attention to the detail to communicate to everybody as you go through. Coaching and developing employees of all ages, educational backgrounds. You may make an assumption that somebody went and they have a psychology degree. You may make the assumption they know this about people. Don't make the assumption. Make certain you tell them what you want them to know and tell them what you want them to do with it. And make certain there's no bones about what you want them to know and what your expectations are. Follow the same typical things. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them in the process as you go through. Coach, develop, make certain that all employees are brought up to the same level. You can sit down in a class of HR. You may know an awful lot about HR, and you sit down there and go through one lesson, you're kind of bored. All of a sudden, boom, maybe I'll actually crack one thing you never thought about. The same thing happens in every training program as you go through. I've sat there and be bored out of my mind listening to somebody babble on, and all of a sudden, a light turns on, and all of a sudden I get one little thing out of it that makes it worthwhile. If you can say 15 minutes a day over one thing you learned in a training session, think of all the hours that you have. 15 minutes a day, that's an hour, 15 minutes every week. That's 52 hours plus a year that you're going to have. You get a whole free week of work because you saved one 15-minute thing that you did. So pay attention to your training as you go through. Certain you give feedback on performance, a good assessment as you go through. Create an environment that's comfortable for employees of all backgrounds to be creative and innovative. That means sometimes you got to back the supervisors off from hyper managing them as you go through. Recognize and respond to generation issues. HR, this is your turf over here on the legal issues. Make certain the employment laws and regulations are followed. That's your job. It's not somebody else's job. It's your job to enforce them, especially the supervisor, if they're doing something improper. You instruct them, you give clear direction of the expectations. This is HR's turf as you go through. Also, discrimination and harassment, they shouldn't exist, except for the fact there's humans out there, and it's part of the nature of humans to sit down and to be imperfect as they go through. Sit down there, train. Sit down there and tell them, and then when it goes awry, deal with it. Don't pretend it's going to go away, because it never goes away. Don't try to hide it just because it's a boss. Be careful about it, because as soon as the boss goes down, they drag you down in HR on top of that as well. So be cautious about it. But that being said, make certain your facts are real facts as you go through, and we'll talk more about that later on. Healthcare coverage, immigration, those are your turf in the bailiwick of HR as you go through. And data security practices, especially about those employment records, is also a legal issue you have to deal with. Ethics, they come from top down. Make certain when you're hiring people at the top that their ethics meet the standards expected by the company as you go through. By the way, if somebody gets hired and they have a different ethics set, either they need to conform or they need to get out in the process. Make certain that you deal with it. Make clear the expectations by having good communications as you go through. Here are some principles for ethical companies as you go through. We're going to deal a lot more on ethics later on. But that being said, almost every class you take has an ethics component. Really, employees are to take responsibility for what they do, have a sense of purpose for division. You want to make certain that there's a sense of fairness that permeates everything, and that there's mutual benefits to the customer and you as well. In HR, your practices should be impact the greatest good to the largest number of people as you go through, and managers should treat employees and customers equally and fairly. As you go through, my trait has always been treat everybody with dignity and respect. One time I got into an argument with a professor at another college. I was the vice president of human resources, and we're just casually talking and everything else, and he makes a statement. And sometimes if you just sit down and you're quiet about something, you sit down and allow bad things to happen. He sat there, he says, my students have to earn their respect. I says, I disagree. He says, what do you mean? I said, I give them respect first, and then if they can lose it if they do something inappropriate. But that being said, I believe I give everybody respect and treat them with dignity and respect when they first meet them. It's incredible how often they rise up to the level of expectations I have of them because I'm giving them respect. He said, well, I disagree. I said, well, then you're wrong. I'll tell you what, I'll bet my grass is greener than yours. Huh? How can you say that? You've never seen my house. I said, let me tell you, one thing that we do at our house, and by the way, we were living in the desert at the time. I said, whenever we sit down, and we didn't even realize this, whenever we have anybody doing stuff for us, in this case, it's the gardeners. The gardeners often, a lot of times, they get no recognition. Everybody just ignores them and they treat them like they're part of the shrubbery. They're humans. And in the desert, it gets hot. So that being said, we lived in a community, a gated community, and we had an HOA, and the HOA fees covered gardening in the front yard. So they would come by, and our habit always is if somebody's doing something cool for you, you take care of them. We would give them a bottle of water. And so that was no big deal. And a couple times, we sat down there, we were baking cookies. I took out some fresh, hot chocolate chip cookies out there. Everybody loves chocolate chip cookies and everything else. And I would give them, if they're out there working, say, hang on, guys, I would go out and I would go in and I'd open a jar of cashews, pour it into little Ziploc bags and give it to them and everything else. It wasn't a big deal and everything else, except we started paying attention. Whenever the gardeners would come on our street, if they saw our cars in the driveway, they would come by our house first. And also, our grass was greener than everybody else's in the HOA because they came by our house because they liked having that personal recognition. That whole thing of treating people with dignity and respect was giving us rewards we never even thought about, because for us, being kind to people is part of the nature of our family values as you go through. That being said, my grass was greener. And by the way, I had no idea what this grass was, but you know what? My grass was greener because our gardeners liked being treated that way, and they took better care of us than other people in the process. We never expected that at all, never asked for that. It came because of that whole aspect of it. And they have other stories about it. Try it and see what happens. Treat them equally and fairly. U.S. businesses, we really have to pay attention to developing global markets as you go through. Use the practices to improve global competitiveness and make certain that when you have employees going off on global assignments, you train them to work well in that culture, because they're going to be away from home, and there's a high termination rate where people self-terminate because they want to come home because they're not prepared for the world that they're in, because the world goes on 24/7 even after working hours as you go through. When you're entering international markets, there's multiple ways of doing it. A lot of times you export products as your first step, and then you have a whole series of things happen where you build manufacturing facilities, you have alliances, and then you do a thing called offshoring or reshoring in the process. We're actually locating physical facilities and creating different branches of your organization out there as well. Another area, not just globalization is the first one, another one is the social networking. It's huge, it's gigantic. Every company should be involved in some form of social networking, including on social media as you go through. Artificial intelligence, recently somebody came out with a report, they sat there and says that San Bernardino County, 42% of all jobs will be impacted by artificial intelligence by the year 2030. The area that was going to be most affected and eliminate a lot of jobs of all places was IT, because a lot of the technical things that are being done by AI, artificial intelligence, are going to be taken over those type of jobs as you go through. So pay attention to AI. You want to adapt it, but watch your back because of the fact that those AIs are coming after your job. So be careful, make certain you have that your job is secure, because some artificial intelligence or a chatbot may come and replace you someday as you go through. High performance work systems are out there in the process. If you want to sit down there and tie people, looking at data, gathering data, and making solid decisions. And a lot of times we're looking at virtual teams that are fragmented across the entire planet Earth. You may be sitting here talking to somebody who's on a line over here, over in Mumbai, India, or over in Germany, talking to them all at the same time. And by the way, if they're talking during daytime on your work shift, they could be working at 2 o'clock in the morning or 7:30 at night, and they're exhausted and everything else. So pay attention on virtual teams. That's becoming more and more the norm. Sometimes you work with somebody 2 or 3 years, you never physically meet them. You only see them on Zoom call or anything else like that in the process. So that's going to be more and more the norm as you go through. HRIS, Human Resource Information Systems, HRIS, there's a lot of information that we have. It's got to be secure, and you got to make certain it can't be cracked. Sometimes a standalone system is better than having a network, but the networking really helps you an awful lot as you go through. Mobile devices, you need to have your HR information available by mobile devices. Everybody's using it. Cloud computing is more the norm as you go through, and there should be an easy to read HR dashboard to help your employees go through the different aspects of their employment history and the record at your company as you go through. 3 continuing challenges that will always be here: globalization and competition from other companies outside of your country as you go through. Sustainability is becoming a major issue across the entire planet Earth. If we abide by the Paris Accord Agreement, just so you know, the opportunity there is $131 trillion in revenue that governments have promised to spend by the year 2050. Man, that's a big market, and sustainability. So pay attention to that one. That's an opportunity for you to grow as a company. Technology, especially HR tech support, is a big deal as you go through. There's a lot of challenges out there as you go through. Look at sustainability. Look on the triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental as you go through. As your company sits here and grows in the process, you'll hear that more and more as you go through. Some of the dimensions of HR practices, if you follow these things as you go through: manage the human resource environment, acquire, prepare the human resources, assess, develop, and then compensate them appropriately, you're going to sit down and lift your company to a higher level in competitiveness as you go out there. So pay attention to globalization, sustainability, and technology. Watch demographic shifts, ethics. AI is going to play a larger role, and always remember, technology is the stealth agent of change. Take care.